We would like to welcome you to the National Weather Service Raleigh Forecast Office, located on North Carolina State Centennial Research Campus. In commemoration of our 20 years here on campus, we will reminisce on the move to our new home and revisit historical weather events through commentary from both former and current staff members. We hope you enjoy.
There were in fact, we were the first federal presence on the Centennial Campus, and in fact, this was moved in 1994, so 1992, 93, early 94, there was some concern about the Centennial Campus making it. It was just, there was a lot of naysayers. A lot of the naysayers were from, I know this will shock you, but they were from Chapel Hill. Oh, they can't do anything like that over at NC State, da-da-da. But it did work, and when everyone knew it was going to work when the engineering graduate school moved here, boom, that was it, and then just opened the floodgates. But looking at where the building is now, Research Drive is just to the north of the building here. There were no buildings north of Research Drive when we moved in 1994. The trees out along Centennial Drive out in front of the building are up 2 or 3 stories now. When we moved in, they were like 6 feet tall. And it's just amazing to see the difference now that these 20-year-old trees, they started out, they were just little guys that came out of the nursery somewhere. It's very uncommon. There was just a handful in the country at the time, in fact, very, very few. But I came here from a tour in Washington, and one of my passions, one of my goals was to get this office located on NC State campus and then to begin collaboration like you've never seen. And it worked. It was just amazing. Things like, over the years, the professors would come down and say, do you have any problems, any issues with forecasting? And when we talked with them about it, all of a sudden there was a graduate student's thesis project, something to help us, that they could bring to us to help with our forecasting. So it was just a wonderful partnership. The office was closed maybe a day or two during the move, and I'll get back to why it was as long as it was. A little monkey wrench thrown into the move on the day of the move. But we did not immediately close the airport office. In fact, kept it open for a year or more because we still had aviation observation responsibility at the airport, and just did it out of the old spaces there. So it wasn't, we had to be out, by 3 days, because the lease was up. The big problem, which was totally unforeseeable, was on the day of the move. It was in January. Bitterly cold. It was bitterly cold. The low temperature that morning was 2 above, and the high temperature that day got to 18. Now we had to move, at that time our equipment was the old AFOSs, which they're in museums now or scrapped, but the AFOSs had a lot of real small, delicate wires, big wiring buses with little teeny wires. So we took the AFOSs out of a nice climate-controlled environment, put them on the back of an unheated truck at about 10 degrees, bounced them from the airport down to the campus, brought them upstairs, plugged them in, and most of them didn't work or had bad bugs out of them or problems that didn't exist before. What we found out is it was so cold that and with the torquing of moving the AFOS equipment, a lot of those wires broke. And it took literally months to work through all the little hiccups and little problems, and usually it came down to finding one little wire somewhere buried in, amongst all the wires in the machines that had broken due to the cold.
The April 16, 2011 tornado outbreak was a historic and memorable event for many North Carolinians. 30 confirmed tornadoes occurred across the state, the greatest one-day total for North Carolina on record. 13 of the tornadoes were classified as strong, some hitting highly populated areas. 9 of the tornadoes occurred in the National Weather Service Raleigh County warning area. 2 EF3s, 4 EF2s, and 3 EF1 tornadoes. A total of 24 people lost their lives in North Carolina, 8 of which occurred in the Raleigh County warning area, second only to the March 28, 1984 outbreak. Total structural damage in central North Carolina exceeded over $300 million.
Yeah, it was probably a once-in-a-lifetime kind of experience. I remember coming in that day. I was off that weekend, but I was needed to come in for overtime on that Saturday. Turns out that's Sunday as well. But so I was working an overtime shift. I came in at around 11 a.m. Several days leading up to the event, it looked like it was going to be a significant severe weather episode. However, we're kind of used to getting these setups where there could be, a major episode, but more often than not, it doesn't happen. And in this particular case, we had a almost perfect setup for Central North Carolina. So there was a fair amount of anticipation that we were going to see a significant severe weather episode. So about noon, I remember the Storm Prediction Center sent a chat on 12Planet, which is the chat system that we use to collaborate with other offices, and they were asked, would you mind if we upgraded you guys to a high risk? And I was somewhat taken aback by that because, we never get high risks in North Carolina. So I told them, whatever in their best judgment, if they felt that a high risk was warranted, then go for it. And they did. So on the 1630Z Outlook, they upgraded us into a high risk, which at that point, I was in new territory. Aside from chasing out in the Midwest, I have not been in a high risk. So it started out, there was a line of thunderstorms developing in the foothills of the Carolinas at about 1 o'clock or so, maybe a little earlier. And this line of convection started approaching the western Piedmont, so east of I-77, Charlotte, Salisbury, Winston. And as it approached central North Carolina, it moved into an increasingly favorable environment for tornadoes. And we began to see circulations within individual cells along the line of convection. And I remember issuing a tornado warning for, I believe it was Person County, and then maybe Alamance, probably Alamance first, then Person counties. And that's when convection was still in a line, and it was what we call a quasi-linear convective system, or QLCS variety of tornadoes, where you get an individual cell within a line that produces a tornado. And so it looked like that may be the character of the event, which, we've seen that kind of thing before, although the setup was more favorable in this case. So at that point, which was probably 1:32 p.m., something like that, I thought that it was going to progress in a way that maybe is typical of this area. However, in about 2:30 p.m., this line of convection actually breaks up and becomes discrete supercells. You could see it happening. And at that point, I knew that we were in a lot of trouble, because classic discrete supercells like what we were starting to see evolve, I've never seen that happen from a line that is progressing from a line of convection into discrete supercells. That's unusual, especially around here, and it's usually the opposite. So when we saw that happen, we knew that we were in a bit of trouble. It started in Moore County, somewhere in Moore County. And it moved up to Sanford, and it ended up producing an EF3 tornado. And at that point, we realized it was also heading right into central Wake County. And there were several other supercells, that had kind of developed from the line as it was progressing east. So there were other supercell storms out there as well that were tornadic. They were somewhat in a line, as you can probably see on the display back there. Warning on those kind of storms, it's actually easy to warn on those kind of storms because it's in the bag basically. You know it needs a tornado warning. It's like, oh gee, okay, do we need a tornado warning? Yeah. So, from that standpoint, it was easy. However, there was the serious nature of the event, and that we had to make sure that the tornado warnings had appropriate impact statements. And in fact, we used tornado emergency and numerous warnings and severe weather statements that followed up the warnings. And that's something that I had personally never used in North Carolina. I think it might have been used once before in a previous event, but never on the scale that we were going to use it that day. And so I think the major thing about issuing the warnings was that we needed to make sure that people understood this was distinct. This is something that happens once in a quarter century, and we're going to have devastating tornadoes similar to what they get out in the Midwest. That same storm that hit Holly Springs ended up coming right toward the office. I think Jeff Warrock talked or noted to Darren, like, hey, this is coming right for us. So at that point, they started to plan what we would do if the storm held together and actually hit the office, which it looked like it could do. So, the plan is that we go down into a stairwell and take shelter in around some concrete stairs on one particular side of the building. So over the next, I'd say, like 10 minutes or so, this was probably about when the storm was 30 minutes out. Over the next 10, 15 minutes, Darren eventually started getting, some of the personnel down into the stairwell, including a student who was here, who was working with me, actually, who's sitting next to me throughout the event. So, he and some others went down to the stairwell first. Then as the storm got closer, most everyone else went down the stairwell, and at some point it was just me, Darren, and Jeff left out in operations, and we were making sure that warnings were in place downstream of the current storms and warnings, and that Blacksburg, who was going to be backing us up when we took shelter, that Blacksburg had everything ready to go. So the three of us were out there, and once we had the warnings out, I really wanted to stay. I wanted to see what was going to happen. I told Darren I would have crawled under a desk if I had to. That I've seen this kind of stuff out in the Midwest before. But, you wanted me to go into shelter, and I think that was probably a good idea. So I ended up going into shelter, with Jeff and the rest of everyone. And what was interesting is, when we were in the stairwell, the lights started flickering and the power went completely out. So we were left in darkness in the stairwell. We were actually using our cell phones as lights, and we were, kind of nervously chuckling, like, oh, I guess it hit us, maybe? We don't know. So after a few minutes went by and we knew the storm was past, we ended up coming out of the stairwell, and it smelled like pine trees. I remember that distinctly. Because of all the trees that were down nearby. Turns out the tornado missed us, I think it was by 1 or 2 miles, maybe 2 miles.
A powerful winter storm dropped record amounts of snow across central North Carolina. The all-time single-storm snow accumulation record for Raleigh-Durham was set with this storm when the airport received 20.3 inches of snow. Over 100,000 customers were without power, and many schools and businesses were closed for several days.
This is Raleigh's Snowmageddon, was January 25th of 2000. And I was due to come in for the midnight shift, but I was awakened by a heavy fall of sleet on the rooftop, and this was at, that evening. And looking outside and seeing the heavy fall of sleet, I couldn't help but want to get in very quickly to try to see what was going on. So I was here by 10 o'clock, and I drove through a heavy sleet, which was transitioning to snow as I came in. And later on, I found out that the snow was coming down at a rate of about 4 inches an hour. So as I came into the office, I saw this picture pretty much here, and immediately the pattern that appeared to me was what I had seen in flash flood courses in the years prior, where they said that the inside edge of this concave portion of this comma head was to be expected as the area to have the greatest potential for flash flooding. Of course, we didn't have rain in this situation, but we had the heavy sleet and transitioning to snow coming down at an exorbitant rate, and a very heavy fall. So as soon as I saw this picture, it appeared to me that we were going to need to really enhance the warnings that to get out there. And as soon as I came in and the NNO called, and I said, yeah, we're going to have double-digit snowfall by tomorrow. And sure enough, it came to pass. It was quite an experience and quite a midnight shift, may I add, watching it pile up out there. I can remember Ron Humble, another forecaster here, at that time going up to the roof to sweep off the satellite dish, because we started to lose communications during that period because of the extremely heavy fall of snow, and he went up there with a broom and actually broomed off the satellite dish so we could maintain communications. So there were a lot of things that were going on during that heavy snow. The lead up to this was that the models that we had grown dependent on were painting a storm much further to the east and offshore than what we ended up getting. And I think the big key to that was earlier on during that day, there was heavy convection, or certainly thunderstorms, down here in Georgia coming up and through South Carolina. And the models have a hard time capturing, especially back during that time with less sophistication of the models, had a hard time handling that extra bit of energy coming in. So we think that it just sort of wrapped up very quickly and deviated leftward, like so many of these very intense systems have a tendency to do. So that ended up giving us that slot of extremely heavy precipitation in the form of sleet and snow, mostly snow as it turned out, as it came up through North Carolina. So that was a model failing in that direction. Interesting enough, later that same year, December of 2000, we had the opposite happen. We had models dumping snow over central North Carolina to the tune of a foot or more. We had forecasts out for heavy snow and accumulating to double digits. Raleigh road race was called off that early December weekend, and as it turned out, nothing happened. The models failed in the other direction. So everybody was, including forecasters, were imprinted to play it cautiously, they thought, and predict the worst, and it ended up that we were basically crying wolf. So you see, the models can take it and they can give it and go both ways. So you really have to look at the trends. You really have to study what's actually happening there, and you can't forget pattern recognition sometimes to help you out. I think that the most impressive event in my time here was the tornado of 1988, November 28th of 1988, and it was because of the destructiveness of that event. And it was pretty much, in the 80s, it was a game changer in many respects. The science was beginning to changed dramatically in the 80s. We had the tornado outbreak of 1984, March 28th of 1984, which prompted the National Weather Service to actually get a weather preparedness meteorologist here to help train the media and to train people and emergency management people about what supercells are about, the types of tornadoes that could occur here in North Carolina, just as they do in the Midwest and the Great Plains. It really was a game changer in our approach to severe weather. And that November 1988 tornado was probably my #1 event. And it's because of the sheer destructiveness of it so close to home. I would say that the snowstorm was probably #2 or #3.
Hurricane Fran made landfall on the North Carolina coast near Cape Fear. Fran became the first Category 3 hurricane to directly hit the state since Hurricane Donna in 1960. The storm brought sustained winds of 115 miles per hour and surging water up to 13 feet in some areas. Inland, Fran brought major wind damage and flooding, making it the worst recorded natural economic disaster in North Carolina history. 4.5 million people in the Carolinas and Virginia were without power, many for up to 10 days. 26 deaths were a direct result of Fran's fury.
Yes, just following the radar trends and analyzing the surface analysis, just the tightness of the storm, we knew that it was going to be a strong storm even after it made landfall. It made landfall during the pre-dawn hours on that morning, and it just was such a tight storm that we knew it was going to be devastating as it even after it made landfall. Well, the winds were very strong, and I've never been involved in a brick building where the building itself actually shook. And so that was one of the most memorable things for me was the building actually shook, and we were sitting in front of the glass windows, and we closed the blinds because we didn't want anything to fly in on us, and at that time. But as I was typing the forecast, I could actually see the table shake that I was with the computers, where the computers were located on, and it was quite an experience. And we were before we closed the blinds, because the trees were quite young, we actually saw the trees. They were bending all the way to the ground. Right on campus, we had a lot of young trees, so therefore we really didn't see the brunt of the devastation of the trees that were down until you got away from campus. But I remember the law enforcement officers, we couldn't get any actual reports because they were delayed in going out, because I remember one comment when we called to the central office was that it's like a war zone out here with the trees down. So they were not sending their officers out because there was so much trees down. And my drive home was very frightening. I finally got relieved around mid-morning the next morning. I'd worked pretty much a 12, 14-hour shift, but I got relieved, and like I said, it was quite frightening driving home. And then as I got closer to my home, my stomach was in knots because I simply just did not know what I would find once I got there. Not at that time. I didn't think about that at that time, because just simply working severe weather events, you just don't know. You don't think about the devastation around you. You know, you have a job to do, and you want to do the best job that you can. I think of it often, but being retired now, I get to enjoy the weather rather than worry about, well, how am I going to make it into the office?